let me first of all say that I was one of the founding, I wasn't a founding, but I was one of the first cohort of researchers who went through the Advanced Institute of Management Fellowship process. And so what I want to talk about today was work that was done initially with that research team, but has now really moved on in various ways. And I'll talk a little in a moment about what those ways are. What I'd like to do is to talk about what we found through the AIM research, and then really talk a little bit about what we've learned since then. Because I think that what we've learned since then, and this is what I guess in the last three or 4 years, is, I think, very apposite to the whole debate about management innovation, about innovation and management innovation in the UK. So let me just begin on that. When I and my colleagues began to research as part of the AIM Fellowship, our interest was in innovation. And at that time, and indeed now, the UK government was very interested in innovation. They wanted to put funding behind it. And I and various colleagues agreed to take a closer look at innovation. And what we did at that stage was to work with a consortium of companies and begin to do a series of research projects that looked at how innovation was created in organizations. And our particular focus of interest was, oh, sorry, I've forgotten there's the camera. Our particular focus of interest were teams. And I'll say a little bit about this later, but I believe, and I think consequently, well, I think that my belief has grown ever stronger, that the value in organizations is created in teams and communities, not by individuals and not by the whole organization. And therefore, when we're looking at innovation, teams and communities are a very good place to start. So as a consequence, we looked at teams and communities, and we had a large number of teams that we looked at. We now have a great deal more, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a moment. But we took a look at what was it that created innovation in teams. And we found that there were 3 things that were important. And I'm just going to show these, sort of as pictures as opposed to as in any other way. But if you take a look at my and my colleagues' writing, you'll see this in much more detail. The first is that we found that teams that are able to be innovative are highly cooperative and collaborative. Now, on the face of it, that sounds incredibly easy, because surely, it's not difficult to cooperate. But actually, what we found in reality, and I think that this is becoming ever more the case, is that people are being required to cooperate and to trust people that they don't necessarily know, that don't necessarily sit next to them, and that they may never even have met. We are currently looking at 100 teams in Nokia, and for many of those teams, there are people in that team that people have never met, never physically met. So the question of trust and cooperation is a lot more complex than it seems, just by one just looks at it. So we found that innovative teams are highly cooperative, but we found that there were also highly cooperative teams that weren't innovative. So clearly something else was in the mix. By the way, when we looked at cooperation, what we found was cooperation at the level of the team and the organization is primarily a culture. So that means that the organizational context plays a huge role, and we were able to determine the organizational factors that seem to result in a cooperative culture. So, for example, we found that role modeling by senior executives and symbolism, cooperative symbolism, seemed to be very important. We found that highly cooperative organizations focused a lot on selection, who they let in. They focused a lot on socialization processes. They focused a lot on promotion. So the context is a very important driver to culture. But as I said, that there are highly cooperative places that aren't innovative. So the second thing that we found is really around the theory of networks. And what we discovered was that cooperative teams that are also innovative have very good networks, particularly into other teams that are different from themselves. Now, those of you who know about innovation will know that that's no surprise, because what we have learned about innovation is that innovation often comes through the combination of things that haven't been brought together before. You know, so an example of that, because I know we'll talk a little about Tesco in a moment, an example of that would be one of Tesco's most innovative HR practices is the segmentation of their employees with regard to employee motivation. Nobody really does that as well as Tesco. Now, that innovation came from the fact that Tesco has one of the world's greatest capabilities in terms of segmentation of their customers, and the combination of, you know, a team that were working on customer segmentation with a team that were working on human resource engagement produced this marvelous innovation. And so what we found is that innovative places have very particular networks. And from a theoretical perspective, this is really talks to the question of networks and boundary spanning. So we were able to identify that in highly innovative teams, there were within those teams boundary spanners who were prepared and able to build bridges with other parts of the organization and indeed into their stakeholder group that became then a conduit of ideas and innovation. And as I'm going to show you later, with some of the recent work we've been doing, we've found that those stakeholder networks are very, very important. So the first thing was about culture. The second was about networks and the quality and extent of networks. But the third thing we found, which I think certainly the literature on cooperation had really ignored, and certainly we'd ignored when we did our own literature search on cooperation. The third thing we found is that innovative teams actually do something that's interesting. And I called this ignition. And ignition took a number of forms. I mean, one form was that there was a question that they found extremely provocative. You know, and in one of my books, I talk about the example of Tata, where, you know, a couple of years ago, the guy that Gratton who runs Tata Motor Group asked a simple question of the whole company. He said, why can't we produce a car that costs 1 lakh? Now, a lakh is 100,000 in India, and he was talking about rupees. So he was actually saying, why can't we produce a car for $2,000? Which is an extraordinary question for the CEO of a motor company to ask. It's not a question you notice GM are asking at the moment. So these questions, and by the way, we then looked at Tata Group, and there was a huge amount of energy around that very, very provocative question. Sometimes it's a vision. And I'm sure many of you here are, I'm personally very engaged at the moment in the telecoms industry. And one of the reasons I'm engaged in them, apart from the fact I believe that some of the most interesting innovations are happening in the telecom industry right now, primarily because of the complexity of their networks. But, you know, in telecoms at the moment, I was down in Africa 2 weeks ago with a company called MTN, who are Africa's sort of Vodafone equivalent. Now, the CEO stood up in front of his employees and said to them, you know, imagine a world. You know, and he then told stories about how connecting people in Iran and Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya, which is what MTN are doing right now, is having a profoundly positive impact on those communities. And he was able to tell this amazing story, a vision of what MTN could be. Ah, here he is. What MTN could be. So sometimes it's about a vision, and sometimes it's about a complexity. Yesterday, with some Nokia teams, I said, what's really exciting you? And when they described it, it wasn't really a vision or a question, it was the thing itself. You know, the job itself was so difficult and sort of complex and meaningful to them that ignited them. And this, by the way, is, if one looks at it from an academic perspective, is a bit about the work that's been done on vision and strategy, but it's also a bit about the work that's been done, which I think has been done on job design. So what I want to say by way of finishing this piece of it is that what we found, and I think multidisciplinary research is so very important, and one of the reasons multidisciplinary research is very important is if you only study cooperation, then you lose the fact that it's actually networks that make a difference. If you only study networks, then you lose the fact that actually it's having an igniting question or a vision that makes a difference. So what I think we've tried to do, and a great tribute I think to AIM in regard to that, is to bring together a set of ideas to talk about something like innovation. Now, the working model that we've got is this model here. And what it basically suggests is that there are three elements which operate at the level of the individual, the team, and the organization that are the prerequisites to the creation of energy and innovation in teams. And there are also a set of productive practices. And the whole thing is, in a sense, moderated by the team itself. So if you're a team of 50 people working right across the world on a complex task, that's not the same as being a team of 5 people sitting together on something that's relatively straightforward. Now, in a sense, when I left AIM 3-4 years ago, that's where we'd got to. So the AIM research really took us to that. And what I want to talk about now is where we've gone from there, because I think it's an interesting story, both in terms of what happens to research, and also it's helped us understand a lot more about this. So that's, and the story I'm about to tell isn't really, it's just a story as it's happening. I mean, we haven't, nothing's been written about it yet. We have a huge data set, as you'll see in a moment. But I think it'll give you a flavor of some of the challenges and issues. So before I get onto that, I just wanted to make a point that organizational context, and I think that academics can sometimes miss that, is changing fundamentally at the moment. I have seen, and those of you who either work in large companies or observe large companies will see that there is a very rapid shift taking place now from organizations being set up as matrix or divisional forms to organizations moving to project teams. Now, that's, of course, always been the case for professional firms, but it hasn't in the past been the case for multinationals. And I think we're seeing it, first of all, in the high-tech multinationals. We're seeing it in telecoms. We'll see it in pharmaceuticals. And that has, I think, the most exciting and the most profound effect on both how an organization behaves and what it feels like to be part of a company. I think we're right in the middle of that change. And so, in a sense, what we've seen, and this is very much part of the team story, what we've seen is a move to organizations that are much more about networks and much less about hierarchies, that are much more about virtual working and less about co-located work, that are much more about volunteer. You know, the interesting thing that professional firms have always understood is at the heart of a project-based company is the notion of volunteering. Because actually, if you have a project and nobody wants to work with you, then, you know, it just doesn't happen. And so that will create a fundamental change in what a manager is. So a manager will become much more an attractor of talent than a, you know, supervisor of talent. And I suspect, and just spending time now with companies right now, actually, all over the... I think that that's happening. I think that slip is happening very, very rapidly. And the recession, interestingly enough, is hastening that. And the reason it's hastening it is that more work is now done virtually because people do not get on planes at the moment. And cost-cutting has taken out bureaucratic layers. So we're sort of slipping towards project-based companies, towards communities towards communities faster than we've ever done before. And I feel personally that that is all for the good. Okay, so post-AIM, these are the two questions that I think we've been able to begin to describe some answers to. And they're, by the way, completely different questions. And the only reason I've bundled them together is that they're both questions that have been very important to AIM. So I wanted to say something about both of them. The first is, and this is those of you who were at Gary Hamel's presentation, it was, the end of last year, wasn't it? Yeah. One thing you'll know, and you may have seen it also in his HBR article called Moonshots, is that there's a big debate around, both with scholars and with practicing managers, about management innovation. And if you remember, Gary's argument is that for all sorts of reasons, and I don't think he quite knows why, and I don't think we do either, organizations tend not to innovate around management practices. And some of you may know Julian Birkinshaw's piece in AMR recently that made the same argument, that actually organizations are very good at managing innovation, or may be good at managing innovation around products or services, but they don't innovate the way that management gets done. So what was very interesting about what we've done over the last 3 years is, because we've developed a management innovation, and I haven't really got time to talk about this today, but suffice to say, we've developed a whole set of very, very sophisticated tools and techniques to support the development of virtual teams. Very, very sophisticated. And so we've been watching, and I've been keeping almost a weekly diary, we've been watching how that idea and technology has been absorbed into companies. And we have some absolutely fantastically interesting observations about that, which I wanted to share with you, because I think it does begin to answer the question of why don't new ideas about management get into companies, which is really at the heart of what AIM is about. So I wanted to say something about that. And then the second thing, I wanted to say something about what the thing itself, which is, how do you develop virtual teams? And we have, post-AIM, have data on about 120 teams around the world which have gone through a development process in a very, as a sort of natural experiment. And I wanted to say something about what we found. So that's what I'd like to talk about now. So we've been engaged post-AIM in a series of natural experiments. And by that, I mean that we have been able to work with companies where we have pre-intervention performance data, where then have been able to look at the intervention itself, and we have post-intervention performance data. Now that, most natural sciences would think that that was an obvious thing to do. But surprisingly, for all sorts of reasons, management scholars tend not to do that. So that's what we've done. We've done a series of natural experiments. Our focus has been on teams. And we've looked at experimentation, this notion of moonshots. Let me say a little bit first about what the management innovation itself was, and then I'll talk about its adoption rates and a little bit about what we've learned from it. Basically, this is the management innovation. What we do with teams is at the beginning, before we do anything, we collect measures of performance of the team. And we use member data, we use supplier and client data to find out how people see this team. And it's a very long survey. It actually takes 40 minutes to complete, so it's a real, really tough survey. But the data it throws out is of a very, very high quality. And we managed to also format it in a way that companies find it very interesting. So we collect a lot of data about the team. We collect data about the individuals in the team itself, and indeed the organizational context in which it sits. We then, and this is an example of one team where you see we look at performance, value creation, incremental innovation, radical innovation, productivity as measured by these various people. We then, in each of the teams, because our question here is, how do you help contemporary teams, i.e. teams which are large, diverse, complex, and often virtual, how do you help them develop? So what we've then done is to build what we call a 60-day learning journey, where we give them all sorts of information. We give them thought pieces, videos, podcasts, tips, tasks, all sorts of things, and we measure their uptake of all of that. And then at the very end, we go back and measure whether there has been any increase in their performance. So we basically have a natural experiment. And because this is now running with, as I say, over 100 teams, we're now building up, we're sort of in the middle of it, we're building up data on what it is that helps teams to get better. And what I wanted to, so that's the management innovation. And what I wanted to talk about first with regard to our early observations, and it's really no more than that, and this is actually, in fact, the first time I've talked about this in public, is that I wanted to say something about the absorption of management innovation. The first thing I would say is it's unbelievably difficult to get companies to absorb new practices. It's much more difficult than I had ever imagined it to be. And it's taken, and I'm a pretty energetic person, it has taken a huge amount of energy to make that happen. That's my first observation. And unless, I think, we as a community change the nature of the rules of the game and the nature of the game, I just can't see how management innovation that comes out of academia will be absorbed by organizations. There are so many barriers to that occurring. So that would be my overall. So what you need is an early adopter. And those of you who saw, did you see the thing in the Times yesterday? I sent it to you.
I read things you send me, Lynda.
You don't read it, or you do?
I do.
You did read it?
Yes.
So one of the very interesting things about that is that the adoption of this innovation has not happened in the UK. So the early adopters have all been outside of the UK, and there's a piece in the Times yesterday about that. Because basically the argument is, here we are doing all this great research, but we don't have any absorption. They didn't say it quite like this, but there's no absorption capability within the UK. So the very first absorber was the Singaporean government. And the Singaporean government have, for the last 2 years, given us unbelievable support in trying to get this thing working. Because they realized very early on that the only way that this would be absorbed is if we could. So companies said to us, well, we love it, Lynda, but does it work? And I'd say, well, I have no idea. Because unless somebody does it, well, how can I tell you whether it's going to, I didn't say it quite like that, but that's what I was thinking. I mean, you've got to run experiments. If you're in the pharmaceutical business, you know this absolutely. You have to run trials, but nobody wanted to run the trials. So Singapore was the only place that said, we will run the trials. And they actually, they've put people on it almost full time, in fact, to work with us to run a series of trials in Singapore to see what could you do to boost innovation. And of course, the reason they did it is Singapore, as some of you may know, is very keen to be the innovative hub of Asia. And the government, despite its current financial difficulties, in fact, I was speaking with them this morning, are still pouring money into innovation. And there's no way that they're going to stop doing it. So early adopters, need to be prepared to take risks. And the two early adopters that we had, which was Singapore and Nokia, are both risk takers. So they were both prepared to go in, having no idea at all whether this thing would work. You know, Nokia was prepared to put this across 100 teams right across the world with no idea whether it would work. And in fact, we're 3/4 of the way through that, and some of it's worked and some of it hasn't. And what's really interesting for me as a co-creator with them is their attitude to failure. And their attitude to failure is, you know, we need to talk to each other every week, but actually if it fails, then so one of the things we're finding is we ask people to volunteer. And then if people are volunteering, but they're not always doing the stuff we want them to do. So the conversation now is, okay, what do we need to do to help people to do this stuff? And we have a whole lot of ideas about it. So the first thing to say is you need early adopters, but let me tell you, they're really hard to find. And you might think, well, surely, Lynda, management consulting practices are early adopters. They are absolutely not. They are. And if it was just one management consultancy practice, I would say, oh, it's all because of X. It's all of them. They are not built to absorb ideas from academia and put them into companies. They just absolutely not. There are, because we're now getting to our second phase. So after 2 years, we've now got results. And in fact, there'll be I hope, an HBR article out in a few months, which will really, you know, change the nature of the game. Because what it will show is that actually you can get significant increase in the performance of a team doing some of the things that we've done in our experimental processes. But what we have found, and this is very interesting, is that there are little groups of people who actually see their job as people who collect knowledge from the outside and then pump it into a system. So there's a little team, for example, who do that for the NHS, and we're just beginning to work with them. So the first thing to say is that it's really, really difficult. And I think unless we change something in the UK, I just don't see how anybody can make this happen. The second thing to say is that there are no absorptive mechanisms within organizations around management. So whilst there may be absorptive mechanisms around, you know, finding new ideas around technology, there isn't around management. And what happens, and it happens very clearly in our work, is that our work fell in between two stools. So it wasn't really about human resources, because it was about teams. And there's nobody in companies that are, you know, I'm the head of teams. There's somebody called I'm the head of reward structures, but there's no one called I am the head of teams. And of course, most innovations are exactly that. So there's nobody to pick it up. And then the third thing, which is catastrophic really for management innovation, is nobody has got any time at all. The very problems that we know need to be solved are the problems themselves that make this thing worse and worse. Because even when executives say we'd like to participate in this experiment, even with a huge amount of commitment and goodwill, they actually can't, because they haven't got the time to do things differently that would help them to get better. So these are just early observations, and if anybody's interested, we'd be very happy to share that with you as we go along. But it's obviously very, very problematic. The other thing that we found, which is much more positive, is that the practice itself seemed to have an impact. And in fact, in some cases, it had a very positive impact. 75% of the stakeholders who looked at the teams said, we have seen an increase in performance in these teams over a 60-day period. And in the case of 45%, they said, or 35%, they said, we've seen a significant increase. And I just want to finish by talking about some of the things that seem to be in place for those teams that made the greatest increase in performance. The first thing is, and this is actually very, very interesting for me anyway, maybe for you as well. The first thing is that you know, we've always really thought about boosting performance and development as something that individuals do and possibly teams do. But what we found is that the teams that had the biggest increase in performance during the 60-day development period were the ones that worked most with their stakeholders. So the ones that reached out to their suppliers and their customers and said, look, this is we're trying to develop as a team. These are what our diagnostics. Can you help us? Were the ones that increased performance the most. Second thing is, and again, this you already know this, but the teams that engaged in real tasks in the 60 days boosted their performance and learned a lot more than those that didn't. Thirdly, we found that teams and companies have what we would call their own learning signature. And what I mean by that is, if it's Nokia and they're all incredibly technological, you can, as we've done, you can build a very complex learning platform and people will come into it in their thousands every day because that's the normal way they do business. They use their computers. We've done stuff with the phones and everything. But there's other companies where they're not using that sort of learning technology. So you have to be very careful about how people learn. We found that the teams that developed the best in terms of performance increase were those where there was they weren't in isolation, but there was rather a whole agenda of which they were a member of, which was talking about some sort of development process. And finally, in a world, and people like the people who have looked at communities like Wikipedia and Linux have already understood this. I hadn't understood it until recently, is that in a virtual world where people are volunteering, you have to have a good process of recognition. And what I mean by that is that what we've learned is that you've got to recognize that people are trying to learn and develop. And we didn't put that in place at the beginning and found that, and I don't mean you pay them something, I mean you actually, there's all sorts of ways of doing it, and we're actually experimenting with that right now. But recognition in a virtual volunteer world is a very, very important part of how you accelerate certain sorts of behaviors. So that's really what we've done. We are very much a sort of an open community. That's our website, www.hotspotsmovement.com. If you go there and register, you'll get a monthly newsletter. You can download chapters of books. My latest book that came out last week called Glow, you can download that. There's videos, there's podcasts, there's all sorts of stuff. What we're doing next, by the way, is we have found through Nokia a really, really marvelous technology team where we are beginning to think about customized development, and where we're also building consortia where teams come together from different companies to support each other. So the story goes on. So we'd love to, get involved with you in any way we can. Thank you very much.